Welcome back to the second part of this video. So that raises a question. What does that grand sweep of history teach us? Well, the first thing we see is the story of sin and holiness. The first theme that we see is God's passion for holiness and ours for sin. And we learn that we cannot deal with sin ourselves. The Old Testament teaches that all people are sinners, and the storyline as a whole quickly leads to the conclusion that people are not able to deal with sin themselves. Adam and Eve sin, so God wipes the slate clean and starts over with Noah. But he and his descendants also sin. God picks one family to bless, but they sin too. And God's miraculous rescue of Israel from Egypt is followed only by grumbling and rebellion. Arrival in the promised land finds things getting only worse. The book of Judges suggests that the problem is that they have no king. But even a king as good as David sins, and subsequent kings lead the charge to idolatry. God warns his people and then disciplines them through exile. But when they return from the crucible of chastisement, they go back to the wicked ways. What is needed, we find, is not a second chance but a new heart. We are sinful, and no solution for that problem is achieved in the Old Testament. God must do something new. We see how sin perverts God's good purposes for his people. That's a huge problem because God's purposes for his people was for them to live lives together that proclaim the perfection of his holy character to the nations around him. As Ezekiel puts it, the people intended to proclaim God's name instead profaned it. What is to be done? Atonement. This is where references to the atonement are significant. The English word quite literally means at one mint. The Old Testament reveals more and more about sacrifice. Several images are used to describe atonement in the Old Testament, but the most prominent is sacrifice. Sinners could seek to restore their relationship with God through sacrifice. We see many sacrifices. For example, Abel's sacrifice, Noah's sacrifice pleases God, Abraham's sacrifice of a substitute, Passover sacrifice turns aside God's wrath, Levitical sacrifices show a penal substitute, the Day of Atonement shows restoration of relationship. Abel's sacrifice is the first described explicitly in Scripture, and then Noah shows that sacrifices pleases God. Abraham's sacrifice of a ram instead of Isaac introduced the idea of sacrifice of a substitute, and at the first Passover, a substitute by which God's wrath was turned aside. And the sacrificial laws on Leviticus introduced an idea not just of a substitute, but of a penal substitute, a substitute who bore the punishment we deserved. A penal substitute who made atonement, as on the Day of Atonement, where punishment was not merely served, but relationship with God was restored. Do you see how the Old Testament gradually builds on this idea of sacrifice? Do you see what God was teaching his people? What the concept of sacrifice teaches us about God and ourselves. First, he was teaching us about his holiness and his passion for holiness. Second, he was teaching that sin is serious, deathly serious, because it is such an aberration from his holiness. And third, he was teaching that atonement could be accomplished when an innocent one dies in the place of the guilty. In and of themselves, Levitical sacrifices were never the point. We see the ineffectual nature of the Old Testament sacrifice. Ironically, sacrifices were most appropriate when the person offering the sacrifice realized that the offering was not sufficient to atone for their sins. So you have the psalmist saying, "Against you, you only have I sinned." Sacrifices were not efficacious except by God's grace. The ineffective nature of the sacrifices can be seen most clearly through the Jewish Day of Atonement. That's a day on which a special sin offering was made for the whole nation. What's striking is that this ritual had to be repeated annually. Calendar-driven, not event-driven. Why? Because the people were in a state of sin, and no animal sacrifice could ultimately remove their guilt. There was no perfect sacrifice. If there had been, the people would have stopped offering them. Instead, these imperfect sacrifices emphasized the fact that God is holy, that sin separates us from God, and that he provides a way of forgiveness. So the Old Testament explores so many different potential solutions to the problem of sin, but ultimately comes up empty-handed. Next we see the Old Testament bookended with the curse. That's one reason why it is bookended with God's curse. Think of Genesis 3. Because of sin, God curses the serpent, the man, and the woman. Here's a question to consider. Does anyone know the last word of the Old Testament? Turn to the last page of Malachi. Referring to the second Elijah, who would be John the Baptist, Malachi writes, "He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with a curse." Curse at the beginning and still under a curse at the end, in the same place as where we began in Genesis 3. This brings up a question that I would call the riddle of the Old Testament. In Exodus 34, the Lord describes himself to Moses saying, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Forgiving, yet not leaving the guilty unpunished. How can that be? Perhaps there is still hope. The story of promise. There is hope, and it is in another story we see in the Old Testament, the story of promise. Yes, the Old Testament ends where it started in Genesis 3, but it also gives us a promise of hope. How will God forgive and yet not leave the guilty unpunished? It all comes down to his promise. And the story of promise begins in the most unlikely of places. The promise to Adam and Eve. It begins in the words of God's curse after the fall. Adam and Eve had chosen to disobey God, and so he brought upon them the just punishment for their sin. But in the very sentence of condemnation, God makes a promise. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. God promises to create division and opposition between his people, the seed of the woman, and Satan's people, the seed of the serpent. And he promises that one day a son will be born who will defeat Satan and deliver his people from their sin. The promise comes out of the blue. Adam and Eve had done nothing to merit it, yet he makes it. Notice the promise has two sides. The seed of the serpent will strike at the seed of the woman, yet the seed of the woman will triumph. The story of the Old Testament is a story of that promise being placed in jeopardy again and again. But against all impossible odds, God ensures that his promise prevails. Cain murders Abel, the line of the woman, but God preserves that line through Seth. Next we see the promise to Noah. Humanity is captured by sin and deserving of God's judgment, but God's promise endures, and he preserves Noah and his family. Then, to assure his promise of deliverance is kept, God makes another promise, never again to destroy all humanity by flood. Centuries pass, people go from bad to worse. And then we see the promise to Abraham. But with Abraham, God picks up that eternal promise and begins to flesh it out. He says in Genesis 12:2-3, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. A generation later, rivalry between Isaac's two sons almost destroys Jacob, but Jacob is the chosen seed, and the Lord preserves him. But once again, God's promise is challenged by a famine that threatens to destroy the whole family. How can God's promise prevail if this family of the promise perishes? That's where we see salvation through Joseph. Amazingly, God uses Joseph's enslavement, imprisonment, and suffering to save his family. He takes what his brothers meant for evil and turns it into salvation and deliverance, not just for the chosen family, but for the surrounding nations as well. Again, the seed of the serpent rears its ugly head as the descendants of Jacob are enslaved in Egypt, and a whole generation of boys is slaughtered at Pharaoh's command. Then we see salvation from Egypt. Again, God is faithful and remembers his covenant with Abraham. He preserves the life of Moses and then uses him to deliver his people from slavery. Then we see law and rebellion. At Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel in much the same way he did with Adam and Eve before the fall. If the people obey, they will stay in the promised land. But if they rebel, God will cast them out. Of course, the rebellion begins almost immediately. God judges his people, but he remains faithful to his promise to Abraham and to Adam. A new generation led by Joshua is raised up, and God gives them the land he had promised to their forefathers. Against all odds, they conquer the Canaanites. Though the people continue to rebel and God continues to punish them, he also raises up judges. These are successors to Moses and Joshua who rescue the people and defeat their enemies. Next, we see God's promise to David. Finally, in an ultimate act of rebellion, the nation of Israel rejects God as their king and asks for a king like all the other nations. In mercy, God anoints a king after his own heart, David, who will be like a son to him. But the serpent even tries to chase down and destroy David from within Israel itself, first through Saul and later through David's son, Absalom. Yet God, who is gracious and faithful, makes yet another promise to David. This is a promise that's really just an extension of his promise to Abraham, and that gives further shape to the promise of Genesis 3. God promises David that he will always have a son to rule on his throne, and that his son will rule in righteousness. The promised seed of Genesis 3:15 is in fact to be a king who will deliver his people. We also see the unfaithfulness of the people and their leaders. At first, it appears that the son is Solomon, but it's not. Solomon proves unfaithful, and judgment follows. Division comes first. The kings in the north are progressively more wicked until God sends the northern kingdom into exile, from which they never return. In the south, there are periodic renewals, but renewals are never complete, and they never last. Finally, God sends Judah into exile, and it seems that his promise has failed. Then we see the promise of a new covenant. But even in the context of judgment and exile, God reveals that he has not forgotten and he has not failed. The prophets are given a message of hope that God will make a new covenant with his people. That turns us to salvation from the exile, yet the new covenant is not yet here. After 70 years in exile, Judah returns to the promised land. The walls are restored and the temple is rebuilt, but God never comes back to dwell in the temple. The new covenant has not yet arrived. When will God finally keep his promise? Well, this is an expectation we're living in when, after 400 years of silence, God speaks and the New Testament begins. That moves us to the conclusion, which raises a question. Does the Old Testament make any progress in God's plan to redeem his people? So do you see how all these pieces all fit together? On the one hand, the Old Testament is a story that moves sideways, never progressing. Solution after solution to our sin is suggested and tried, only to result in failure. So by the end of Malachi, we are no better off than we were in Genesis 3, except that we know for a fact that we cannot save ourselves. But on another level, the Old Testament is a story of forward motion because it's a story of promise. God gradually reveals more and more of his perfect plan to redeem a people for himself. And as that promise takes shape, hope is born out of despair of sin and a stage is set for Jesus Christ. He would live as the perfect Israel and die as our substitute, the perfect Passover lamb. Through his death on our behalf and his resurrection from the dead, he would reconcile us to God, as Paul put it in Romans 3. This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Just and the one who justifies sinners, forgiving, and the one who does not leave the guilty unpunished. The promises God made through the centuries find their answer in Jesus, the answer to the riddle of the Old Testament. Well, that is the message of the Hebrew Scriptures. And here are a few books that we recommend you reading. The Message of the Old Testament, Promises Made, which this class draws heavily on, and the Introduction to the Old Testament. Well, that's all for this session. In our next session, we'll be looking at two seeds, Genesis 1 through 11. Thanks for joining us for UC University Old Testament Overview. Stay safe. See you later. See you soon.